Hello, I'm Father Gregory Pine, and this is Pints with Aquinas. And in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about total depravity and why we as Catholics don't hold for it. So, stay tuned. Okay, so perhaps you have had total depravity explained to you, or perhaps you've heard of it in like the wider Christian conversation. The idea there being that our nature is so wholly devastated or so wholly destroyed as a result of original sin that we can lay claim to no good of whatsoever type. Mind you, that is a kind of a caricature or an oversimplification. We're just going to take it as a way by which to explicate a doctrine which differs in subtle ways from that proposed, oftentimes in the Reformed tradition. So, St. Thomas Aquinas will teach that as human beings, we were created in a state of grace, but beyond just having grace, we had further benefits or further privileges in our original state. So grace subjects our minds to God and makes it so that we have a kind of balance or order or equilibrium, which then resonates through our nature. So then our lower powers, like our passions, for instance, are subordinate to our higher powers, intellect and will. And so each will incline to its proper end and do so in a way that is orderly because it does so in coordination with other inclinations. And then finally, the body is subordinate to the soul such that it doesn't rebel against it in the way that we presently experience. And that would mean like impassibility or, in addition to that, immortality. So by virtue of this singular gift or this singular privilege, we would have had these great benefits of grace accorded to our nature. But then with original sin, we choose against that dispensation, and then we forfeit all that I just described, which is tragic. But also, it brings about a kind of, I don't know exactly how I would describe it, but it upsets the order of our nature. So no longer do we have grace, whereby intellect and will are subordinated to God. No longer do we have integral nature, whereby lower powers are subjected or subordinate to higher powers. No longer do we have these associated privileges of impassibility and immortality. Rather, we're given to decomposition, decay. We're given to death. So when we describe this original sin, I guess the real question then is, how do you characterize it, and then what becomes of human nature as a result? St. Thomas is insistent that what original sin is specifically is the loss or the privation of original justice or rectitude. So all of these great gifts which were accorded to us in our original state, when lost, they leave in us a kind of nostalgia, or we feel a conspicuous lack of what we previously had. So it's not as if we're returned to a state of pure nature, because we live in a kind of salvation history and we retain the memory of God's original designs or God's original purpose in creating us. And in addition to that, when we choose against God as we have, there are certain wounds which register in our nature. So St. Thomas will say that, our intellect suffers from ignorance, our wills suffer from malice, and then he divides up the passions between the irascible power, which are like the passions which concern difficult things, and then the concupiscible power, which are those passions which concern more kind of simple, less complicated things. And so he says, in the irascible power, we experience weakness, and in the concupiscible power, we experience concupiscence. Effectively, what this registers for us as is a kind of like dulling of the mind, a kind of twisting of the heart. And so what formerly for us would have been easy in our original state now is very difficult, and it's just made more complicated. So the Fathers of the Church have a way by which to describe this, and you can read a really excellent commentary on this in Pope Benedict's Jesus of Nazareth, Part 1, in the way in which he describes the parable of the Good Samaritan. But we'll speak of our nature as having been despoiled of grace and wounded in its nature. So we lose the gifts of grace entirely, and then we are wounded in our nature. But to be wounded in your nature doesn't mean to be changed in your nature. So we retain our essential hold on the human nature with which we were blessed. So recall, original sin isn't like a radical reorientation of a nature. Rather, it's a kind of leaving of nature to itself. That's how T.C. O'Brien describes it in his commentary on the particular part of the Summa where this comes up in that long Blackfriars translation. So the reason for which we wouldn't hold for total depravity is that we need a kind of continuity of human nature in order for salvation, in order for redemption to appeal to us as human beings. So if something like total depravity were true, there'd be real questions that we would have to raise about the continuity of our nature. Is Jesus taking a human nature? Is he taking a fallen human nature? If those things are different? And if so, that causes for us some serious soteriological problems. So we want to affirm the essential goodness of our nature. And if you think about this practically, it's like, okay, not all is lost. St. Thomas will say, for instance, that there are quite a few things that we can do just by nature alone, and he vindicates the goodness of the natural order. He says, you can build roads, you can plant vineyards, and he says, et alia huius modi, and other things of such like. Now, mind you, by virtue of the fact that we are downstream of original sin, again, life is more difficult, life is more complicated. What formerly might have been clear to us, or even in a theoretical state of nature might have been clear to us, now is more obscure, now is, poses many more pitfalls. But it's still the case that human nature is given to us, that it remains good, and that we're able to act out of it. And so, it's still worthwhile to describe acquired virtues. Things that you can acquire by repeated practice or by repetition. I guess that'd be a more simple way of saying it. This still holds now. Again, more difficult, more obscure, far many more pitfalls. But still, there's a kind of integrity too. There's a kind of goodness of our human nature. And it's essential that we hold for that because it gives grace a place with which to interface with our nature. And it assures the solidarity of our nature with that human nature, which Christ assumed in the incarnation, and by which he merits our salvation. So, those are some things to think about when it comes to total depravity, and then when it comes to the Catholic teaching concerning the same or concerning the different. So, are we fallen? Yes. Are there things about our nature which have become worse than they formerly were? Absolutely. Are we still entirely subordinate to the order of grace and to God's initiation? Yes. We can't give ourselves the beginning of faith. No, we can't. We can't pull ourselves up by our own grace-filled metaphysical bootstraps. Not a chance in the world. So we're still receptive. We're still given to God's initiation, to God's, kind of provocation, which is great. But we believe that he addresses his salvation to a real, a genuine, a yet even still good nature with which he blesses us, with which he endows us. So that for us is decidedly good news. Not because now we can, gin up the courage to do those things we've always wanted to do, mindful of the fact that our nature is good enough to pull them off. Now, I'm not saying just like go it alone without God, but I am saying that we, as human beings, can have a real relationship with God in which we stand to him as secondary causes, as instrumental causes, as genuine protagonists of our own salvation, as ones who have been formerly bestowed with great graces, subsequently lost them, but are now destined for a how much more, with a real continuity in the context of a salvation history where Christ goes before us, accompanies us, and fills up what is lacking in all that we do. Ooh, got a little excited there at the end and started talking real fast. Okay, so that's all I have to say about this. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do. Push the subscribe button. Stumble words. Push the subscribe button and then push the bell so that way you get updates on whatever happens. And in addition to that, if you haven't yet checked out Godsplaining, which is a podcast of the Dominican Friars of the Province of St. Joseph, to which I contribute with 4 other friars, do so. Sweet 30-minute episodes each week, guests, live streams, Lectio Divinas on the Sunday readings during penitential seasons. Oh yeah, it's great stuff. So I think that's all I have to say. God's blessings on you. Please pray for me, and I'll catch you next time on one of these here videos. Cheers.